Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first event organized by the Aberdeen Italian Circle. We are here tonight. We are meeting. We are going to be in conversation with renowned author and a friend of the Italian Circle, Philip Paris. David Dreyer, who is the secretary of the Italian Circle, and we will interview Philip in a moment. I would just like to say a few things. I would like to thank a few people tonight. First of all, the people that are watching us from Orkney. I know that there are many viewers there. And some of you may know already that the Aberdeen Italian Circle is part of the Società Dante Alighieri in Rome. The Dante Alighieri is a society that promotes Italian language and culture around the world. And the Aberdeen Italian Circle is a branch of this society in Aberdeen, Scotland. Also, to thank, I can see in the list of, of attendees, Letizia Chiocchetti. Many thanks for being here tonight. And before we start with the interview, I would like to show a very short video with some images of the chapel for those of you that are not acquainted with the location. We just received so many hellos and messages from across the UK, from Italy, from many different locations. So thank you everyone for joining in. Welcome also to the many Dante groups around the world. So we are in conversation this evening with a renowned author and a friend of the Italian Circle, Philip Paris. Philip, as you may know already, is the author of Orkney's Italian Chapel, which is a non-fiction book, and then 2 novels, The Italian Chapel and Effie's War. Of course, Philip has published many other books, but tonight we are going to talk more specifically about the chapel and Italian prisoners of war in Orkney and Scotland. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
fantastic to see you. Thank you so much for talking to us this evening. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you came across the chapel and how did you decide to research on it and write a book about it?
Well, this all came about in 2005 when Catherine and I went to Orkney on our honeymoon. And we were very lucky. The first full day we went to the chapel, and I knew nothing at all about the building. But we were very, very lucky because we had it entirely to ourselves for the whole time that we were there. And I would say to anyone that if you go to the chapel and it's busy, just wait, because the groups tend not to stay very long. And if you can experience the building with just a few people or maybe just yourselves, the atmosphere is just so different. And so Catherine and I went in. It was a beautiful day, and we each bought the little copy of the little booklet that you could get just inside the doorway. And we walked separately down the nave, slowly looking at the booklet, and we caught up again at the beautiful rood screen, Giuseppe Colombi's beautiful rood screen with its secret of love, which had yet to be revealed to the world at that point. And we gazed with in awe at Domenico Chiacchetti's paintings. And we were just moved to tears. It seemed extraordinary. I couldn't believe that a Second World War Nissen hut had moved us so much that we were both had tears streaming down our face. And before we'd even walked back out the front door, I had decided that what I was going to do was to find out everything I possibly could about the building and the men who created it. And I really had no idea what I had set out on, because it became a quest that consumed every spare minute for the following 4 years. And during that time, with great help from John Muir in Orkney, I can see he's listening. John had been secretary of the Preservation Committee, and over the years he had a huge list of contacts of people, and so he was vital to me in my research. And during that time, I was able to chat to elderly men who had been prisoners of war in the camp, the descendants of the key artists, the granddaughter of Major Buckland, who was the senior British officer in the camp, and the daughter of the senior Italian, Fornazier. And there was one day when Catherine and I actually went to the Kirkwell nursing home, and we saw 101-year-old Alison Sutherland Graham, whose father had owned Lamham during the war. So they had a lot to do with the Italians, and she remembered them, of course. She was old enough to remember them, and they'd had a lot of dealings. And all of these people had a part of the chapel story, and no one had really asked them to tell it before. And I wrote, never having done such a thing before, never actually having considered being a novelist, I wrote a historical fiction based on the story of the creation of the chapel. And I was very lucky. The manuscript was picked up by one of the big Scottish publishers, and that came out in 2009. And that set me on my road to writing books. So I then wrote a non-fiction book about the chapel, a very different book, tells the story of the chapel, but in a totally different way. I actually had a lot of information you couldn't put into a novel, and I had lots of, obviously, photographs and images. And so I put that together, and the non-fiction came out the following year. So in fact, I only realized today, I was thinking about it, that it's almost exactly its 10th anniversary, because it came out in the autumn of 2010. So my non-fiction book is just about, I can't remember the quite exact date, it was either September or October. So it's just on its 10th anniversary. And that one visit, the first full day of our honeymoon, that just had such an important impact on our lives, but on my life, particularly as a writer, because it got me into writing books when I'd never actually even considered writing books.
It changed your life forever, literally.
It did, yeah, it did. And we've made so many good friends in various countries because of the chapel, and you know, there's that whole aspect of it as well, not just the writing side.
Of course. Thank you, Philip. Just before I forget, I would just like to welcome some more people that have joined very recently in these last few minutes. I will just ask everyone again to mute their microphones, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to Philip at the end of our interview using the chat function, but I will give instructions in due course. David.
Okay, hello, Philip.
Hello, David. Hello.
Could you set the scene for us? Take us back to the political situation at that stage of World War II that resulted in Italian prisoners of war arriving in Orkney. And in 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies, I assume that changed the whole situation there for the prisoners. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, indeed. They're two very interesting questions. I always feel that the story of the chapel goes back to that terrible morning of the 14th of October 1939, when 3 torpedoes tore into the side of HMS Royal Oak, and more than 800 men lost their lives. It was a terrible tragedy just a few weeks into the war. And just to explain that background, Scapa Flow is an area, it's about 120 square miles of sea encased by Orkney Islands, and it was being used by the British Home Fleet as a safe harbour. So they had sunken ships that were beyond their useful life, and they had nets and booms to seal, to make it all safe. But Germany had actually spotted a flaw, the gap between the island of Lammam and mainland Orkney. And on that night of the 13th of October, a U-boat entered the sanctuary of Scapa Flow. HMS Royal Oak was sitting there, and it was sunk within about 15 minutes. The U-boat went back to Germany, and Winston Churchill ordered that these eastern entrances into Scapa Flow should be sealed permanently. They quite rightly assumed that that was how the U-boat had got in. And so began what was actually the biggest engineering feat in the Second World War. It was a colossal undertaking to create barriers. Technically, it was phenomenally difficult. But work began over that winter of 39. And as the months went on, they actually began to run short of manpower because men were being conscripted into the military. But the British authorities, they held tens of thousands of Italian prisoners of war that had been captured in the North African campaigns. And so during the summer of 41, around 1,200 men were selected from a camp in Egypt, and they were transported, eventually arriving in Orkney in the February of 42. And I've totally forgotten the second part of your question, David. Oh, capitulation, sorry.
You've got to be careful.
I've got to remember it now.
What I asked was, we step forward to 43, and when the Italians surrendered to the Allies, how did that change the dynamic in the camp?
Yeah, sorry, that was the second very good question. I'd forgotten. So Italy effectively changed sides in that September of 43, and the British government and their allies were totally a bit of a loss as to what the position of Italian prisoners of war should be. There was nothing in the Geneva Convention that gave them guidance for country changing sides during a conflict. And so for several months, things just carried on, and there was nothing, not really any change to their lives. It was not until the April of 44 when, if we take Camp 60 on Lammam, which is the camp that we're talking about, the men were gathered on the parade ground, and they were given the chance to be volunteer cooperatives, and they would have different conditions. They would have a different uniform, not POW uniform. They'd be paid in real money, not camp tokens. They'd have much greater freedom, and that was significant for them being able to source materials for the chapel. And if men didn't want to accept that, they wanted to, basically they remained loyal to Mussolini, they would be moved to another camp, depending actually on how many men wanted to do one thing or the other. In each of the Orkney camps, about 15, and there was about 500, 550 men in each camp. There were two camps, Bury and Lamham. And around 15 in each camp wanted to remain loyal to Mussolini. And after a couple of days, once the authorities had organized transport, they were moved to another camp. But it's a very sad story in many ways, that men who had been friends for years, suddenly they were on completely opposing sides. You know, one was either remaining loyal to Mussolini and would carry on as a prisoner of war, exactly as they had been, or they were not. There was no middle ground. So there's a lot of sadness as well in that leaving. But the men in Camp 60, they had greater freedom and they could more easily source materials.
Follow up exactly on this point, because the perception that we have from reading the book is that when Italian prisoners of war arrived in Camp 60, the situation was pretty, you know, the conditions were pretty basic and there were frictions with the authorities of the camp. How did the conditions improve as such so that they had the idea to build the chapel and they could source the material?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to imagine, really, that these men had been in the North African campaigns, they'd been in a camp in Egypt for quite a long time, and then they were put in a hold of a ship, and basically went, 3 months later, they end up in the February, in the middle of winter in Orkney. So the weather, was just completely alien to them, and the food was alien, the work conditions were harsh, and they were in the prisoner of war camp, which in fairness they had been used to that in Egypt, but it really did hit them hard, and they actually went on strike, which as a prisoner of war is not a thing you would rush to do, but there was a series of strikes that rumbled on. There were some periods of punishment rations where they want bread and water. And there were various meetings with various authorities and the protecting power for Italian POWs. They did go back to work, but unrest really rumbled on. In Camp 60, we're just talking there, throughout the summer. And then into September of that year, everything changed because they had the arrival of Major Buckland. Now, he was no doubt handpicked for the job. He was 53, which I now look at that and think, well, it's quite a young man. Anyway, he's 53. But of course, the Italians were all up to 20 or early 20s or younger. And he was very much a father figure. And he spoke Italian and he loved everything to do with Italy. And the atmosphere changed completely then. The unrest disappeared. So it was a very different camp from that point onwards. And he was very enthusiastic and keen to help the Italians in any way that they could. But the thing that the idea of a chapel had been suggested, had been thought of by several people. But what Camp 60 lacked was a priest. It had no priest. Now, unlike the Bury camp, where the other Italians were kept, they had a priest from the initial time they arrived. And they also had an artist, a man called Panisi, and they built a chapel. So they had their chapel built much earlier than the one in Camp 60. But it was not until they had to wait another 12 months. So it was actually the September of 43, the same month Italy capitulated, pure chance, that Padre Giacomo arrived in Camp 60, and he became the Cassavist. We can see a picture of Padre Giacomo is a much earlier part of his life, and the idea of building the chapel became a reality. So I don't know if that answered your question or whether
yes, it does.
Whether I answered something else entirely.
No, perfect. Thank you, Philip.
We've got a group of POWs on a remote Scottish island, and a decision was taken to build a chapel. So how do they obtain the time? I mean, they're there doing a job. How do they obtain the time and the materials to build a chapel in that environment?
Yeah, the time-wise, obviously they were governed by the Geneva Convention, so they weren't working all the time. They didn't work on a Sunday. There's an interesting little aside, because sometime after they'd been there working on the barriers and the block-making yard and the quarry, the authorities offered them the opportunity that if they met a certain quota of output, once they've met that quota, they could then finish for the day. And I forget the figures now, but the output increased significantly for about an hour and a half a day less work, because they could see that if they really, worked really, really hard for a short period of time, they could have more free time. And so that was that's what they did. I mean, the Balfour-Beatty men actually had to work their 10-hour shifts, whatever they'd produced. So they did have quite a bit of time, but crucial to your point, David, was that Major Buckland, once they started work on the chapel, Major Buckland allowed for the key artists to work full time on the chapel, as long as their work was covered by other men, other prisoners of war, which was not an issue. And so Chiachetti, Palumbi, the blacksmith, Buttapasta, the stonemason, and some others, they were allowed to work full time on the chapel. Now, to your second point about materials, the one thing they had a huge amount of was cement, concrete, and which Domenico used to put to great use making the altar rail and the altar. But one of the things that the Italians had in a great abundance, apart from skill, was their imagination. And the block ships that had been sunk in the channels, some of them you could actually get to them at low tide, and Major Buckland gave them permission to go into these ships. And so they were actually able to source quite a few materials from these part sunken ships. So the tiles on the floor in the chancel that you can see today, they came from the bathroom of a German ship. There was the wood for the tabernacle. Brass stair rods were made into candle holders. Used bully beef tins, but these were not off the ships. I think these were just, they'd eaten the bully beef and they had the empty tins. They were turned into lanterns, which you can still see hanging from the ceiling today. So they used their great imagination and their skill to create really this tremendous work of beauty.
Yes, it's amazing. And you have rightly mentioned the name of a key person in, making the completion of the chapel possible, and this is Domenico Chiocchetti. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about Domenico? Was he a trained artist?
Yeah, I mean, one of my great regrets is that Domenico had died long before I started my research. But I got to know the Chiocchetti family, and they were extremely helpful in helping me, not just the dates and facts and figures, but what he was like as a man. He was apart from being, he was very skilled, but he was a very humble man. But he had a great, quiet man. He had a great sense of humour. But he had trained as a painter of religious icons, so he was absolutely the perfect man to be driving forward the creation of the chapel as we see it today. And he did all of the painting in the chancel part that is still there to this day.
Yes. Oh, this is another.
Yeah, actually, I'll just jump in there because we're seeing a black and white photograph of Domenico on the left and Giuseppe Palumbi, the blacksmith, on the right. And these black and white photographs were taken by a man, an Orcadian photographer called James Sinclair. And because of the sensitivity of Scapa Flow, how near it was to that, James Sinclair was the only civilian with a license from the military to take outdoor photographs. You actually were not meant to take photographs outside. So all these classic black and white shots that we see, like this one, or the sports days, or men just in the camp, they were almost certainly taken by James Sinclair. So it's quite nice to give him that tribute for his enormous effort in the records that he created.
Thank you, Philip, for sharing them with us. And so you were telling us Chiocchetti was a trained artist, and so it was easy for him to find inspiration for his paintings, for the chapel then.
Yeah, what he did, he actually, before he left home and went into the war, his mother gave him a little prayer card, and he carried that with him throughout the war, and he had it when he was in Orkney, and it had an image on it which was the Madonna and child, baby Jesus with the olive branch, and he used that as the guide for the famous painting which we see in the chancel today, the Madonna and Child. He added quite a lot. Oh, there we are. We can see it. He added quite a lot to it, and the other images were created from his own imagination, and the ceiling and the sides. But he said in later years that what inspired him was to create something of peace. You know, war was raging. Italy was in a very bad way, and men were greatly worried about loved ones and families back home. And he wanted to create something that represented peace. And I think that was, if you like, the inspiration. The little prayer card was perhaps a physical guide of something that one could use, but the inspiration was to create an icon of peace.
Of course. Thank you.
Can you tell us anything, Philip, about how he actually achieved the work? What materials did he use? What did he paint on? I mean, we're talking about effectively a Nissen hut. So what did he paint on? And where do you get the paints in somewhere like Orkney in the middle of a war?
Right. I'll go back a step. The original, in fact, I might go back 2 steps, because the Major Buckland helped to source 2 Nissen huts, which were moved to Camp 60 and placed end to end on new foundations to create a bigger building. And the initial idea was to change one end to make it, here we can see the outside of the chapel. The original idea was to just convert one end into the chancel and have the rest as a school. So it was only one end of it that was initially worked on. So what the men did, they built a wooden frame, and against that they lined, technically it was actually compressed cardboard rather than plasterboard, but that's maybe a small point. And they built a wall to create the sacristy, and that was obviously behind the altar, which we see today. So, I'll have some water. Excuse me. And so, as to his paints, he bought them, or he didn't buy them, I suppose they were bought actually from a shop in Kirkwall. And he said that they were pastes in glass jars, and I think they'd be water-soluble paints, and he would mix them on a palette, and that was how he created the paintings. But one of the little human stories, and there are so many human stories connected to the chapel, was that Domenico became friends with the manager at this shop in Kirkwall. And this man was called Ernest Marwick, and he actually went on to be quite a well-known Orkney writer and author. And the 2 men remained friends right up until Ernest Marwick dying.
Thank you again for these wonderful images that you shared with us. There is another crucial figure in your research, somebody that has been very important in helping you piecing together the memories of the Italian prisoners of war, and this is Gino Caprara. Can you tell us a bit more about Gino? I know that you have been to Rome back in February, so in pre-COVID times.
Oh, indeed, there I am, yes. I'll just clarify, sorry, I'll just clarify that's me in the kilt in case there's any confusion between which is the 100-year-old. Yeah, sorry, I jumped in there. Yeah, Gino Caparra is a most extraordinary man. I was put in touch with him via John Muir, and Gino has a phenomenal memory for the time he spent in Orkney. And it's fair to say, without his help, I couldn't have written the books that I did, because he could tell me, you know, what was on the mattresses the first day they arrived, you know, how many blankets, a spoon, a knife, and a plate, and he could talk about the food, he could talk about the work being done. And his help was absolutely crucial to me writing the historical fiction and then the non-fiction. And he is an absolutely extraordinary man. He's become a very dear friend, and he was 100 at the beginning of the year. And fortunately, before any travel restrictions, and we went out with in fact, John Muir and his daughter. We went out to Italy, and it was a day we will never ever forget. Gino's 100th birthday party. We met up with a lot of other friends from Italy, all with connections to the chapel. And yes, I took my kilt, as you can see.
And you look great, and I can see that Gino is wearing a tartan scarf as well.
Yes, oh yes, he had his bit of tartan on, yes, and he was singing and dancing and gave a fantastic big speech.
Excellent.
Absolutely extraordinary day. I'll never forget it.
Brilliant.
Oh, Philip, am I right in thinking that the chapel was finished only just before the prisoners left Orkney? In the book, The Italian Chapel, you write that men put their souls into this, and they left part of themselves behind. Now, was there actually a plan with what would happen to Camp 60 when the Italians left?
Yeah, just to go back to the timing, so it was the November of 43 when the 2 Nissen huts were brought to the camp and put together. So it was only from that point onwards that the work began on the chapel. A lot of here's another iconic picture. These are the 24 key men who worked on the chapel outside of the building. So this would have been late summer 44, this shot. The chapel was a series of different projects, if you like. They converted one end into the chancel. Giuseppe Palumbi was given the task of building a rood screen, beautiful rood screen, wrought iron, which he did. But then it was decided that the school classes would be moved elsewhere, and they would convert the rest of the building. So then another framework was built and plasterboard fitted. Panisi was brought over from the other camp, the artist Panisi, to help Domenico with the painting. And when that was going on, it was decided that they needed to create a facade to hide the rather ugly entrance of the Nissen hut, and that was where the stonemason Putapasta came in. And the last thing the men did before they left was to cover the roof with cement to try and make it watertight as much as possible.
I read that.
So they actually left on the 9th of September 1944, and they were moved down to a camp in Skipton. And Domenico was allowed to remain in the camp. It was quite interesting that all the Italians went down to Skipton, but a small detachment of British Army were left to take apart some of the kitchen ranges and the bedding and things that could be used elsewhere. And the only thing that had not been finished by that point, by the 9th of September, was the holy water stoop. And Domenico got permission from Major Buckland to remain, and in those 10 days he built the holy water scoop, which is still there inside the front door to this day. And then he went down to Skipton and joined his colleagues. So yeah, it was only in use for quite a short while, unlike the chapel in the Bury camp. But I think the important thing was not just that really, but the fact that it was the concept of the chapel. You know, it helped the men's morale. You know, they were creating something that they could go in, and it was very similar in many ways to the churches that their families and loved ones would be praying in back in Italy. And it had a huge impact on the well-being of the men, even before it was anywhere near finished. So the fact that it was only completed for quite a short while, I think shouldn't detract on its importance to those men in Camp 60.
Of course. Yes, we have seen from the aerial view that David showed in the short video at the beginning, that of course the chapel is built in a very exposed location, exposed to the elements.
Yeah.
So how did it survive for all these years?
Oh yeah, no, here, yeah, see, we can see a picture of Lamham, and yeah, and this hut I don't believe was ever meant to last for decades and decades, and it is amazing that the building is there as it is. What actually happened? So sorry, I don't think I quite answered David's question about was there a plan. So I can answer that now. In fact, everyone had a willingness that the chapel should exist. Patrick Sutherland Graham, who owned the island of Lamham, there was a bit of confusion, I think, went on. He was sort of waiting for the Catholic authorities, church authorities, to do something, and I think they in turn were waiting for him to do something. And for many years, nobody really did anything. And when it got to about 1958, and the building was in quite a perilous state by this point, but it was saved by the intervention of Father Whitaker, who was the Catholic priest in Orkney and Shetland, and he heard of the chapel's plight and immediately contacted Patrick Sutherland Graham, who said straight away, yes, let's do something to save the building. So they formed the Chapel Preservation Committee, which goes on to this day. Their work continues, obviously, with different people. But they got in the original the tradesmen that were needed to make it watertight, make it safe. And if I'm not going off at too much of a tangent, the men that the committee could say that the main person that they needed to get hold of to do the restoration work to the paintings was Domenico Chiacchetti, but no one knew where he was, because after the war, the Italians, you know, they were scattered around Italy, and everyone lost communication. But there's this very interesting little, again, story that is just fate. When Domenico was in the Skipton camp, he became very friendly with a local couple called Mr. and Mrs. Harvey. So many years later, you've got the formation of the Chapel Preservation Committee, and they're wondering how on earth they can find this artist. And they got the BBC involved, and the BBC broadcast a programme on radio about this chapel and how there's a group of local people trying to find the artist who did the marvellous paintings of Madonna and Child. And Mr. and Mrs. Harvey heard this recording. So they rang the BBC and said, well, we actually know where Domenico Chiacchetti lives, in Moena, in the Dolomites. Now, in those days, little villages no one had a telephone in their house. So Domenico, I think much to his great surprise, he got a message one day that he had to go a few days later to the local town hall to take a telephone call from the BBC in England. And the outcome of that was that the BBC paid for him to come back to Orkney in 1960. And he spent 3 weeks working on the paintings and overseeing further restoration work. And that really, you know, that was the saviour of the chapel. Then he came back a couple more times and he did extra bits of work, but it was saved in essence from that point.
Fantastic.
And there's another little human story I can tell you if you want, and it just shows how the chapel brought people together, because Domenico became quite friendly with Major Buckland. And at the end of his 3 weeks in 1960, Domenico went down and had a few days in England, staying with, well, retired, he wasn't a major anymore, with Thomas Buckland, and they remained friends until Thomas Buckland's death.
Excellent.
So let's move tack a little bit, Philip. Let's talk about your novels. Effie's War. Now that appears to have been inspired by the story of Italian prisoners of war in Scotland. So did you have an interest in that subject, in Italian prisoners of war, or was it a result of the research you did on the chapel that sort of inspired you to do more and write the book?
Well, I had no knowledge of Italian prisoners of war until we went to the chapel that day in 2005. So that really was the beginning of my research into that whole subject. But I have to explain just very quickly the background to Effie's War. As a writer, if one of the marvelous things that sometimes comes your way is you see a subject that is just screaming to be written about in depth in form of a novel or whatever, and it hasn't been written about before. And with Effie's War, this was a story in the November of 1943, around 900 people in the Tarbet Peninsula in the Highlands, so between Tain and Port Mahomac, were given 4 weeks to leave the land. And that included lots of farms. The village of Inver had to be evacuated, the closure of schools. And the farms had to sell all their livestock, and they had gathered the crops but not processed them. And nearby in Kildare was an Italian prisoner of war camp, and the Italian prisoners were brought onto the farms to live for those few weeks to help process the crops. The people were told that the military wanted the land for battle practice. The secret bit, which no one knew, was that they wanted a part of the beach near Port Mahomac to rehearse for the D-Day landings, obviously scheduled for the following year. So that was highly secret. So there was this fantastic background to a story that when I heard it, I thought, well, this just has novel written all over it. But it's quite interesting. I mean, you've got the Italian chapel historical fiction and Effie's War historical fiction, and in many ways they look the same. They're both Second World War, they've both got Italian prisoners of war in, they're both based on real events. But the big difference, certainly from a writing point of view, was that in the Italian chapel I write about the real people, and I call them their real names, and where I can tell you what happened to them after the war. And yes, there are some fictitious characters, and I think everyone accepts that the dialogue is made up. But in Effie's War, the characters were all fictitious. And that made a huge difference in terms of a writing project, how you approached it, how you did the research, the freedom you had with totally fictitious characters. Because with the Italian chapel, I didn't want to make up things about real people who lived. So, and the timescale, of course, in writing them. So though on the surface, they actually look quite similar historical fictions, they're actually very different, certainly from a writing point of view. I don't know if that answers your question or not. So.
I think it does. You seem to have now developed a little bit of a track record in this field. So can we expect any more novels for the similar theme?
Hopefully some novels in the future. I never say no. There's nothing about to be published in the near future, that's for certain. Whether they'll include Italian prisoners of war or I don't know. There's no plans for that, but you could never say no.
We are just getting to the conclusion of this interview, and I would just like to say to anyone that wishes to ask a question to Philip, you can now start to use the chat function. You can see the speech bubble at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on it and type your question for Philip starting from now. Thank you. And talking about Effie's War.
Oh, Effie's War. Oh.
Which is your last one, your last novel. Did you find any resistance in the local communities when you were researching for the settings, the historical data for the novel? Because at the end of the day, these Italian prisoners were the enemy, and there was a huge cultural divide, different language, different religion? What was your feel?
No, everyone I approached, both in my research for the Italian Chapel and Every's War, were really happy to help. Though I didn't come across any historical animosity or feelings of hostility. Not at all. Everyone seemed to look back fondly with the memories of the Italian men that were working on farms or working on other factories. And no, there was never any hesitation. And you're totally reliant as a writer on the help of people to give you some of their knowledge, because you can't write the historical fiction without that ability to be able to either call on people who were involved or call on experts. And everyone has been extremely helpful, really, from the very beginning of my writing.
Thank you, Philip.
So, just to finish up, Philip, before we move on to the audience questions, in your book there's a letter written by Domenico in 1960 when he revisited Orkney, and he addressed it to the people of Orkney. Now, for me, that letter says so much about the bond that developed with the people of the Orkney Islands. Could you read that letter out for us?
Yes, I would be honoured to read it. It's actually in the non-fiction, but I know it's at the back of the historical fiction. It's probably quicker to find because I finished it. Right, here we go. Yes, so this was the letter that Domenico gave to the people of Orkney after his 3 weeks there in 1960. Dear Orcadians, my work at the chapel is finished. In these 3 weeks, I have done my best to give again to the little church that freshness which it had 16 years ago. The chapel is yours, for you to love and preserve. I take with me to Italy the remembrance of your kindness and wonderful hospitality. I shall remember always, and my children shall learn from me to love you. I thank the authorities of Kirkwell, the Courteous Preservation Committee, and all those who directly or indirectly have collaborated for the success of this work, and for having given me the joy of seeing again the little chapel of Lamham, where I, in leaving, leave a part of my heart. Thanks also in the name of all my companions of Camp 60 who worked with me. Goodbye, dear friends of Orkney, or perhaps I should just say au revoir. Domenico Chiocchetti.
Thank you very much, Philip. This passage was very moving, and I would just like to thank again Letizia Chiocchetti, who I've seen in the background screen. So it's now time to ask questions to Philip, and we had a string of greetings from people attending from so many different locations. There is one question from John Andrew. Says, Philip, John Andrew here, can you explain the role of Balfour Beatty in the construction of the barriers and the role in assisting with the construction of the chapel?
Yes, good point, John. The Balfour Beatty were already working in Orkney on several construction projects when Winston Churchill ordered this huge construction of the barriers, which became known as the Churchill Barriers. So Balfour Beatty were awarded the contract, and they actually set out to retrieve some huge cableways that they had been using for a project in Iraq, which they eventually managed to get back to the UK. And after various strengthening, these were the Blondins, these famous, when you see these famous shots of the construction of the barriers, these huge cableways that stretch right the way across the channels. And so Balfour Beatty were responsible for the building of all the barriers. They were involved in sourcing material, plant and equipment. It was a vast undertaking. And they were also it's quite interesting, I think, with the chapel, how it crossed so many barriers. It broke down, barriers, people of different beliefs and nationalities and religions. And when the men wanted to, the idea of building the chapel was first mooted, Balfour Beatty stepped in and donated the concrete for the foundations, and they were very willing to help in supplying the cement that was used for building the altar and the altar rail. So there was quite a synergy between the big construction company and the individual men in the camp.
Thank you, Philip.
That answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, there is a question that actually I wanted to ask you, and it is, how were these prisoners chosen, selected to go to work on these barriers? There was a plan, or was it casual?
Oh, right, yeah. What happened was that there were around 1,200 men were chosen from the camp in Egypt during the summer of 41. And they were selected on 2 points, really. One was their skills and their abilities. So there were actually 2 artists. So there was Domenico in Camp 60 and Panisi and the Borough camp. And they had joiners and bricklayers, and they had electricians, and they had other men with different ranges of skills. But the second thing the authorities were keen to have was not to have men who were fiercely loyal to Mussolini working on the outskirts of Scapa Flow. It was too dangerous. So they were the criteria, if you like. It was a skill set and an attitude of beliefs. And then when the men arrived in Orkney at the beginning of 42, and they were split between the 2 camps, and they were pretty evenly divided, almost in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the skills that they had. So, which is why the 2 artists were split up. They were actually friends, but they got split up, one in each camp.
Well, fantastic. I was looking at the range of locations from where our viewers were attending your interview, and we have audience ranging from Siena to Toronto. So I would just like to thank again everyone for staying with us, all the friends and members of the Dante, all the friends and members that have an Orcadian connection, Letizia Chiocchetti, and of course you, Philip. Do you have another question, David, or do you think we can show the second short video before we close our event?
Yeah, I think we can show that video. Okay. I'd just like to say thank you to Philip as well. That was really...
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, thank you to everyone for listening.
And then I will say a couple of more things before we say goodbye, but in the meantime, let's have a look at the short video. Ask questions to Philip, but you didn't have time tonight. You can do so by using the contact form that Philip has in his own website, and the address is philip-paris.co.uk/forward-contact. philip-paris.co.uk/forward-contact. Or you can email us Aberdeen Italian Circle @gmail.com. Aberdeen Italian Circle @gmail.com. And by thanking Philip and David and everyone, I just launched the appointment for the next meeting, which will be on the 11th, Wednesday, the 11th of November at 7:30. It will be Dr. Joanne Anderson talking about her latest book, Moving with the Magdalene, about medieval art and devotion on the Italian Alps. And good evening and many thanks. Thank you, Letizia, for being with us. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.